Welcome back to Chapter 22, Part 2. Again, in this part, we're going to look at a couple of other alternative definitions of species and why we have multiple definitions of species. And then we're going to look at the role of geography. So let's start out by looking at alternative definitions for the word species. And the reason that we have multiple definitions for species is because the biological species concept has some pretty important limitations on them. It cannot be applied to fossils, for example, right? Because we use remember the term biological species concept applied to things that are living and can hybridize, and whether they're fertile offspring. And how do you know this if you're looking at the fossil record? You can't. So that means that you can't apply the biological species concept. It also does not apply to asexual organisms, because for asexual organisms, they're not having sex. That's what asexual means. And the biological species concept absolutely depends on whether or not two organisms can have babies. So definitely a limitation. The biological species concept also emphasizes absence of gene flow. Now, I know I talked a little bit earlier in the previous video about how gene flow kind of keeps different populations of members of the same species together. But if we're trying to figure out if two things are different species, we kind of just assume that gene flow isn't happening. But it does sometimes happen. And a good example of this can be seen between grizzly bears and polar bears. Now, grizzly bears and polar bears don't tend to live in the same area, and so there's not a lot of gene flow between them. But sometimes matings do happen in nature between grizzly bears and polar bears. And when that happens, you get a growler bear. And this is a growler bear. And this growler bear is, it's vigorous and it can have its own babies. And you might think that, well, then, according to the biological species concept, the grizzly bear and the polar bear should be the same species. But biologists consider them as separate species. And that's because, for the most part, they have very different characteristics and they live in very different areas. So let's look at some other ways that biologists use the definition of species in different ways and how it applies to things like the polar bear example. And we're going to go into some more complicated examples too. So, other species concepts tend to emphasize unity within a species rather than separateness. The biological species concept emphasizes separateness, but the morphological species concept emphasizes unity. So remember that morphology is the way something looks. So the morphological species concept defines species by the way it looks, by their structural features. This applies to both sexual and asexual species, which is good. It also doesn't depend on information about gene flow, which can make things pretty complicated. A disadvantage to the morphological species concept is that it is very subjective, and so we have to rely on experts in the field saying, well, these two species, they're different enough, so I'm going to call them different species. Another species concept is called the ecological species concept. The ecological species concept says that, well, you got species, we'll say you're the same species if you have the same ecological niche. Now, in this class, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about ecological niches, but let me give you a quick definition of this and tell you the pros and cons of the species definition. An ecological niche is how something lives in its environment, the things that it eats, the migration patterns, the way it builds a nest, what eats it. So those are the parts of an ecological niche. The ecological species concept says, okay, you're the same species if you inhabit the same niche, and you're different species if you inhabit a different niche. Again, what you eat and how you live and what eats you, those kinds of things. The good thing about the ecological species concept is that it does apply to both sexual and asexual species, and it also emphasizes the role of disruptive selection. If you don't remember this definition of disruptive selection, you might want to go back into your notes and take a look at that. So I could go on and on about these different definitions of species. There are, in fact, 20 other definitions of species that have been proposed, some of which are very interesting. Some of them overlap the ones that I've already talked with you about. But the usefulness of each definition, and I'm only going to give you the three that I've given you already, right? The biological species concept, the morphological species concept, and the ecological species concept. But the usefulness of each definition depends on the situation, and it also depends on the questions that each scientist is asking. So that's why we have so many definitions of species. But again, if we're trying to think about the way things evolve, the biological species concept is the most useful concept. So we're going to move now into thinking about how geography plays a role in the process of speciation. And it turns out that speciation can occur either with geographic separation or without geographic separation. So here you can think about this as a pond, right, with fish. I mean, it looks like a pond with fish, so it's easy to think about it that way, I guess. What happens if you have geographic separation? What happens if this little bit in the middle here keeps building up and building up? Well, you could get two different species because they're isolated from each other. There's no gene flow. But you can also get species forming even when there is gene flow around this area. So that's what we're going to spend some time talking about, is the difference between this word here, allopatric speciation, and sympatric speciation. So let's start out with allopatric speciation. Literally, allopatric means other country. Allo means other, and patric, I always think about patric as like patches, but literally from the Latin, it means other country. So allopatric speciation, the gene flow is interrupted because one population is divided into subpopulations, smaller populations, and those smaller populations are geographically isolated from other subpopulations. So before I had asked you, like, how did that flightless bird, end up on the Galapagos Islands? And the answer here is seen in allopatric speciation. There was a population, it split into subpopulations. One of those subpopulations ended up on the Galapagos Islands, and that population accumulated enough genetic differences, including, interesting in this case, the inability to fly. Now, cormorants, and this is a kind of cormorant on the Galapagos, cormorants are actually known for their ability to swim and dive, and most cormorants are not very waterproof, even though they swim and dive in the water. So it kind of makes sense that that one might evolve to not have the ability to fly. Another thing about allopatric speciation is that it absolutely depends upon the ability of a population to disperse. So for example, like a canyon here, this is the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is a barrier for these little chipmunks, right? Or we call them ground squirrels also, besides chipmunks. So these little rodents, they can't, get past the barrier of the Grand Canyon, but a bird, can. Coyotes are big and they can get from one side of the canyon to another. So can pollen from trees. So while the Grand Canyon is a barrier to these two little species of chipmunk, it's not a barrier to the trees or to the coyotes or to the birds. another thing that we know about with allopatric speciation is that when you have separate geographic areas and there's no gene flow, you can have divergence. And the first thing that you need for divergence in genetic divergence is you need to have mutation, right? We've already talked a lot about mutation and how mutation it creates variation. If you don't remember that, go back and look at chapter 21. But then after the mutation happens, other forces come into play, like natural selection and genetic drift. And remember, both natural selection and genetic drift can change the allele frequency of a population, but natural selection is the one that ends up with adaptations happening. So the example I'm going to step you through is the example of the mosquitofish. And mosquitofish are found in the Bahamas. And there are several isolated populations in different ponds in the islands of the Bahamas. Mosquitofish populations in these ponds sometimes are found with predatory fish, and sometimes they're found in ponds where there are no predatory fish. And so it turns out that mosquito fish that live in the ponds where there are predatory fish, they look different than the ones that live in ponds without predatory fish. I like that your book has color-coded these fish with these little orange dots, and that corresponds to the orange bar here, and these green dots correspond to the green bar here. So let me explain to you what these data are showing you. In the ponds where the mosquito fish are found with predatory fishes, the mosquito fish evolved this very streamlined body. Look how like straight that body is. Very streamlined. Look at that line coming off of there. And very strong, powerful tails. So this is a very, like, you can almost think about how large that tail is. It's very powerful. It's got some powerful muscles there. This is opposed to the mosquito fish that live in ponds without predators. So look at the body shape. It's much more curvy here. And the tail, the thickness of the tail is much less thick. It's thinner. So they are not very good at rapid bursts of speed because their tails are thinner and their muscles are lower. There's just less musculature in the tail. So you can see this in the graphs here. When predators are present, mosquito fish have a very fast escape velocity, and it's much slower escape velocity when their fish have evolved where there's no predators. In addition, we could look at survival rate. And so what they did was they took the fish with predators and without predators, and they put them in a pond with predators, and they looked at survival rate. And of course, the ones that had the ability to escape were much more likely to survive than the ones that had evolved without predators around. We can see similar kinds of examples in here. We're going to be looking at fruit flies raised on different diets. So reproductive barriers like this can evolve in a lab population, and we've seen this. Scientists have seen this over and over again in lab populations of fruit flies. These are different fruit flies they're raised in these little vials, and they have different food available to them. And so these ones are going to be isolated from these by being raised in this little vial. And you can take the offspring of this one and put it into a vial of similar food, and this could go on for many, many, many generations. In fact, experiments with fruit flies have been lasting hundreds and hundreds of fruit fly generations. Fruit flies have a generation time of about 3 weeks. So in these isolated populations that are raised on different diets, they have evolved so that they prefer to mate with partners that are adapted to the same food source. They really don't prefer to mate with flies that are adapted to different food sources. And we can see that in this diagram right here. So here's our initial population, and some of those individuals from this population were put in food where there's lots of starch, and others were put in food where there's lots of sugar, in this case maltose, the sugar maltose, and they were raised for 40 generations. Now remember, 40 generations, that's 40 times 3, that's 120 weeks, right? This experiment didn't take more than a couple years to run. And in the end, what they saw was that here, looking at the number of matings between the different groups, females raised in starch and females raised in maltose, males raised in starch and males raised in maltose. They basically did these comparisons where they put a female with starch, raised in starch, and a male raised in starch together, and looked and see whether they made it or not. They did the same thing for a female raised in maltose and a male raised in starch. They put them together and they looked to see whether or not they mated. And it turns out that there were way more many matings of like food, starch here, and maltose here, and much fewer matings here and here. So this kind of allopatric isolation, this geographic isolation, happened in the lab. Now, you might think that just because, they might have, like, the starch ones were raised isolated from the maltose ones, maybe that's why they were not really happy mating with them. So what they did was they looked at matings between different starch populations. They also did this from maltose populations, by the way, but I'm only showing you the data from the starch populations. So 2 different populations of starch 1 and starch 2, males, starch 1 and starch 2. There's literally no difference between these matings here. As long as they were raised on the same type of food, in this case starch, they all mated with each other, readily. So it had to do with the isolation based on food preferences. We can see evidence of allopatric speciation in nature too. An example here is seen in these snapping shrimp. Now, these look a little bit like lobsters, but they're much smaller than lobsters. And in this particular group, we call them sister species because they are closely related to each other, but they're different species. So we see these different sister species located on opposite sides of this Isthmus of Panama. And so these sister taxa are isolated from each other by this land mass, and the ones on this side of the Isthmus of Panama do not mate with these ones because of geographic barriers. And in fact, if you put them together, they won't mate either. Now, interestingly, these ones are found on the same side of the Isthmus of Panama, and so are these, but they're different species. And that starts to get into a little bit of sympatric speciation, which we'll cover in a little bit. So just kind of starting to sum up this evidence for allopatric speciation, regions that are isolated or highly subdivided. You can think about like different canyons in a mountain range or something along those lines. You're going to have allopatric speciation, and there's going to be more species around because of that allopatric speciation than you would find in areas where there's less subdivided barriers, fewer barriers. So more barriers is equal to having more species around. Like more geographic barriers, you're going to end up having more species there. When there's fewer barriers, there's going to be fewer species around. Also, we can say in general that isolation between populations does increase as distance between them increases as well. So barrier doesn't just have to be like a mountain range, it can just literally be distance. geographic isolation does prevent breeding between species, but physical separation itself is not a biological barrier to reproduction. Biological reproductive barriers are something intrinsic to the organisms themselves. It's that concept of the mechanical isolation or the behavioral isolation, right? Those are biological reproductive barriers. And it's only biological barriers, this is so important. It's only biological barriers that can prevent interbreedings when two populations come into contact with each other. If you don't have that innate biological mutational, barrier, then if two species come together and we thought they were two different species, but they mate freely, then they really are considered to be the same species based on the biological species concept definition.